The world feels different now, not because one single event happened, but because a quiet shift has been unfolding for decades and has finally reached a point where it can no longer be ignored. Rising costs, shrinking opportunity, and a growing sense of disconnection have created a pressure that many people feel, but few openly talk about. What we are witnessing is not a sudden collapse, but the result of long term decisions and messages that reshaped how men see society and how society sees men. Stay with me to the very end, because once you understand how this shift unfolded, it becomes impossible to unsee where things are headed next. For a long time, the public conversation has focused on surface level problems like high rent, expensive food, stagnant wages, and a general sense that life feels harder than it used to. Those are real issues and they matter, but they are symptoms rather than the root cause. Beneath them is something deeper, something structural, something cultural. Society has been slowly hollowing itself out, and one of the most overlooked elements in that process is the withdrawal of men from participation. This withdrawal did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because men suddenly became lazy, bitter, or disengaged for no reason. It happened because for roughly half a century, men were told in increasingly direct ways that they were not needed, not wanted, and not valued unless they conformed to constantly shifting demands that never seemed to end. For decades, men were told to step aside, to be quiet, to make room, to change who they were, to apologize for existing, and to accept blame as a default position. At the same time, they were expected to continue producing, paying, protecting, and providing. This contradiction was never resolved. Men were told they were the problem, yet also expected to carry the load that keeps society functioning. When you tell a group of people that they are unnecessary while still demanding their labor, resources, and compliance, eventually they will stop listening. And that is exactly what happened. Men did not riot, they did not organize mass protests, they did not burn anything down. They simply walked away. This, this withdrawal has consequences that are now becoming impossible to ignore. While women make the majority of consumer purchasing decisions, men still shoulder most of the tax burden. When men disengage from society, both consumption and taxable income decline. That creates a feedback loop where governments struggle to fund programs, businesses lose customers, and the cost of living continues to rise as the system tries to extract more from fewer participants. This is not a moral judgment, it is an economic reality. A society cannot function at full capacity when a large portion of its contributors have emotionally and socially checked out. The withdrawal of men did not begin with dating or relationships, but that is where it became most visible. For many men, relationships gradually transformed from something that offered companionship and purpose into something that felt exhausting, one sided, and emotionally draining. Men were told that if relationships failed, it was always their fault. If they were unhappy, they were told to do more. If they were confused, they were told to listen harder. If they expressed frustration, they were told they were the problem. Over time, this constant pressure created burnout. Men began to realize that no matter how much effort they put in, the outcome rarely changed. A critical moment in this realization was when many men understood that they were no longer having disagreements based on shared reality, but instead navigating emotional terrain where logic had little value. Arguments stopped being about solving problems and became contests of emotional endurance. Men found that presenting facts did not lead to resolution, only escalation. They noticed that after conflicts, women often felt relieved or energized, while men felt drained and diminished. Over time, men learned that avoiding the argument entirely was healthier than trying to win one that had no finish line. As this pattern repeated across countless relationships, men began to reassess what they were actually gaining. They were investing time, energy, resources, and emotional labor, yet receiving constant criticism and conditional approval. The promise that things would improve if they just tried harder never materialized. Instead, the expectations kept increasing while appreciation declined. Eventually, many men reached a breaking point, not in anger, but in exhaustion. They stopped trying to fix what could not be fixed and started asking a different question. What if peace was found not in chasing approval, but in stepping away altogether? Solitude, once framed as failure, slowly became redefined as freedom. Men discovered that life without constant emotional negotiation felt lighter. Their homes were quieter, their schedules were their own, their finances were more stable, their stress levels dropped. For the first time in years, many men felt calm. This calm was not loneliness, it was relief. And once that relief was experienced, the idea of returning to the previous dynamic became unappealing. This shift caught society off guard because it did not match the expected narrative. Men were supposed to keep chasing validation. They were supposed to compete harder, earn more, and prove themselves endlessly. Instead, they opted out. They focused on work without emotional entanglements, hobbies without judgment, and routines that brought them peace. Some traveled, some invested in personal growth, some embraced simple, quiet lives. What united them was the realization that they no longer needed external approval to feel whole. At the same time, many women found themselves facing a reality they did not anticipate. The assumption was that men would always return, that they would always adapt, that they would always be there to fill the gaps. But as economic pressure increased and institutional support weakened, the absence of men became more noticeable. The state could not replace personal responsibility indefinitely. Programs became strained. Costs rose. The safety net thinned. Suddenly, the independence that was once celebrated felt fragile. This is where the tension intensified. Women who had been encouraged to delay relationships in favor of careers began to reassess their priorities. Many realized that professional success did not automatically translate into personal fulfillment. The promised balance never quite arrived. And as biological timelines became harder to ignore, the desire for family and stability resurfaced. But by then, many of the men who might have filled that role were gone, not physically, but emotionally. They had built lives that did not revolve around romantic validation, and they were not eager to dismantle them. Another factor that accelerated this divide was the changing perception of intimacy. For many men, intimacy stopped feeling safe. It became associated with risk rather than connection. The constant framing of men as potential threats, combined with public narratives that assumed the worst intentions, made even basic interaction feel hazardous. Men responded by minimizing exposure, fewer conversations, fewer dates, fewer chances for misunderstanding. Over time, desire itself diminished, not because men lost interest in companionship, but because the cost of pursuing it felt too high. This dynamic created a strange paradox. Public discourse insisted that men were privileged, powerful, and dominant, while simultaneously portraying them as unnecessary, dangerous, or incompetent. Living inside that contradiction took a toll. Men began to realize that no amount of self improvement would resolve a narrative that was designed to keep them perpetually at fault. Once that realization settled in, disengagement became a rational choice. The cultural divide widened further as public spaces became less welcoming. Gyms, cafes, workplaces, and social venues that once served as neutral ground became arenas of tension. Men learned that even neutral behavior could be misinterpreted. Rather than constantly self monitoring, they chose avoidance. This was not bitterness, it was boundary setting. Men were not trying to punish society, they were trying to protect their peace. As this withdrawal continued, A growing number of men concluded that the traditional relationship model in the West was no longer viable for them. Trust had eroded, expectations were mismatched, incentives were misaligned. Even men who still valued partnership began looking elsewhere, not out of hostility, but out of pragmatism. In other parts of the world, they found cultures where roles were clearer, appreciation was mutual, and cooperation was still valued. These men were not seeking perfection, they were seeking stability. What makes this moment different from past cultural shifts is its permanence. Previous cycles assumed reconciliation. This time, many men are openly stating that they are not coming back. They are not waiting for apologies. They are not negotiating new terms. They have accepted that the damage is done and adjusted their lives accordingly. That acceptance is what makes this shift irreversible in the near future. This does not mean that all men or all women are the same, or that individual relationships cannot still succeed. It means that at a societal level, the trust required for mass participation has been broken. Once that trust is gone, rebuilding it takes generations, not slogans. People adapt to the environment they are in. And right now, adaptation looks like separation rather than integration. We are now living in the after effects of that decision. Economic strain, social fragmentation, and widespread dissatisfaction are not isolated problems. They are interconnected results of a society that pushed away its contributors and assumed they would never leave. Men did leave quietly and peacefully, and in doing so, they changed the trajectory of the culture itself. That is the reality we are facing, and it is only the beginning of a much larger story. As the shift continues, what becomes clearer is that men did not leave because they hate society, nor because they want chaos or collapse. They left because participation stopped making sense. When effort is consistently met with criticism, when contribution is met with suspicion, and when sacrifice is treated as obligation rather than value, withdrawal becomes a form of self preservation. Men did not wake up one day and decide to abandon relationships, communities, or public life. They slowly realized that no matter how much they gave, it would never be enough. And that realization settled in quietly, year after year, until walking away felt less painful than staying. One of the most damaging elements in this process was the constant rewriting of rules. Men were told to be strong, then told that strength was threatening. They were told to lead, then told leadership was oppressive. They were told to provide, then told provision was control. They were told to be emotionally open, then punished when that openness did not align with expectations. Every adjustment they made was framed not as progress, but as the new minimum requirement. There was never a finish line, never a moment where men were told they had done enough. Eventually, many men understood that the game itself was unwinnable. This understanding reshaped how men viewed their own value. For decades, male worth was tied almost entirely to utility. What do you earn? What do you provide? What can you fix? What can you sacrifice? When men questioned this framework, they were accused of selfishness or fragility. But questioning a system that only values you for output is not weakness, it is awareness. Men began to see that they were being asked to give endlessly while being told they were inherently flawed. That contradiction erodes motivation faster than any external hardship. As men disengaged, they stopped internalizing the constant messaging that they were inferior or defective. They began to observe patterns instead of absorbing blame. They noticed that many conflicts were not about behavior, but about control. They noticed that compromise was often one directional. They noticed that accountability was selectively applied. These observations did not come from resentment, but from distance. When you step back, patterns become easier to see. Another major shift occurred in how men viewed time and energy. In the past, men were expected to pour their best years into building relationships that promised long term stability. Today, that promise feels uncertain at best. Legal, social, And cultural frameworks have made long term commitment feel risky rather than rewarding. Men noticed that the cost of failure was high, while the rewards of success were increasingly unclear. Faced with that imbalance, many chose to invest their time elsewhere in careers, personal interests, fitness, learning, or simply peace. This reallocation of energy had profound effects. Men who stepped away from constant relational stress often experienced improvements in mental clarity and physical health. They slept better. They focused better. They felt less anxious. This reinforced their decision to remain disengaged. Once you experience what life feels like without constant tension, it becomes difficult to justify returning to an environment that feels draining by default. At the same time, the broader culture struggled to interpret this withdrawal. Rather than asking why men were leaving, much of the conversation focused on shaming them for doing so. Labels were applied, motives were questioned. But shame is a poor motivator, especially for people who have already decided that approval is no longer worth chasing. The more men were criticized for stepping back, the more certain they became that stepping back was the right choice. Economic pressure amplified everything. As costs rose and wages stagnated, the margin for error shrank. Men who once might have tolerated dissatisfaction in exchange for stability no longer saw stability as guaranteed. The social contract felt broken. If hard work no longer ensured security and relationships no longer ensured partnership, then the rational response was to minimize exposure to loss. Men adjusted accordingly. This is where the narrative around independence becomes complicated. Independence was framed as liberation, but independence without cooperation creates isolation. When men and women stopped seeing each other as complementary and started seeing each other as adversarial, cooperation collapsed. Men did not replace relationships with hostility, they replaced them with distance. That distinction matters. Distance is quiet, it does not protest, it does not argue, it simply removes itself from the equation. As distance increased, so did misunderstanding. Women were often told that men would eventually come back, that they would adapt, that they would soften. This reassurance delayed honest reflection. By the time it became clear that many men were serious about their withdrawal, the cultural tools needed to address it were gone. Dialogue requires mutual trust, and trust had already eroded. Another element that accelerated the divide was the commodification of relationships. Dating became transactional. Metrics replaced connection. Endless choice replaced commitment. Men noticed that they were evaluated like products, compared, ranked, and discarded. This environment discouraged investment. When something feels disposable, people treat it accordingly. Men responded by opting out of the marketplace altogether. The long term impact of this shift extends far beyond dating. Families form less frequently, communities weaken, institutions strain. A society built on participation cannot function when participation becomes optional and unattractive. Men are not sabotaging the system by leaving. The system is revealing its dependence on those it dismissed. What makes reconciliation unlikely in the short term is that men are no longer asking to be understood. They are not waiting for validation. They have already built lives that function without it. Many men now see emotional independence as a form of wealth. They guard it carefully. Anything that threatens it is evaluated with caution. This does not mean men have become cold or indifferent. It means they have become selective. They are willing to engage where respect is mutual and expectations are clear. They are unwilling to re enter dynamics that require constant self erasure. That line, once crossed, is rarely uncrossed. As this reality settles in, society faces a difficult choice. It can continue to deny the shift and hope it resolves itself, or it can acknowledge that pushing away half its contributors has consequences. Repair, if it ever happens, will require humility, accountability, and time. None of those can be rushed. As men settled into this new reality, something unexpected happened. The fear that had once kept many of them engaged faded. Fear of being alone, fear of social judgment, fear of missing out. Those fears had been powerful tools for decades, quietly guiding behavior and enforcing compliance. Once men realized that solitude was not only survivable, but often preferable, those tools lost their power. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Without fear, the incentives that once drove participation stopped working. You cannot pressure someone who no longer feels threatened by withdrawal. This shift exposed a deeper truth about how social systems function. Every system relies on voluntary participation, even when it pretends otherwise. When participation is driven by shame, obligation, or constant correction, it remains fragile. Men recognized that their involvement was being extracted rather than earned. That recognition changed everything. Contribution stopped feeling noble and started feeling exploitative. When that perception takes hold, the emotional contract dissolves. One of the most profound changes occurred in how men viewed sacrifice. For generations, sacrifice was framed as virtue. Men were told that enduring discomfort was proof of character, that suppressing their needs was maturity, and that their reward would come later. But later never arrived. Instead, the demands multiplied. Men began to ask an uncomfortable question. If sacrifice is endless and appreciation is conditional, is it still virtuous or is it simply submission? That question marked a psychological turning point. With that shift came a reevaluation of identity. Men stopped defining themselves by external approval. They no longer measured success by relationship status or public validation. They focused on internal metrics instead: peace, stability, autonomy. These became the new markers of a good life. This was not a rejection of responsibility, it was a redefinition of it. Men took responsibility for their own well being rather than outsourcing it to unstable social dynamics. As men withdrew, they also stopped explaining themselves. Early on, some tried. They wrote long messages, had difficult conversations, attempted to articulate their frustrations. Those efforts were often dismissed, minimized, or reframed as personal failings. Over time, men learned that explanation invited argument and argument drained energy. Silence was more efficient. Silence required no defense. Silence preserved peace. This silence was misinterpreted as apathy or bitterness, but it was neither. It was resignation. Men accepted that the system would not change in response to their words, so they changed their behavior instead. Behavior is the only language that systems truly respond to. And the behavior was clear: less dating, less marriage, less engagement, less visibility. As this pattern spread, it began to influence younger generations. Younger men observed what happened to those who came before them. They watched the outcomes. They listened quietly. They learned early that participation came with risks that were rarely discussed openly. Instead of rebelling loudly, they planned carefully. Many decided in advance that they would not follow the same path. This generational transmission of caution accelerated the trend. The cultural response to this was fragmented. Some voices called for understanding and reform. Others doubled down on blame. The louder the blame became, the more detached men grew. You cannot shame someone into caring when they have already decided that caring costs too much. Every attempt to guilt men back into participation only reinforced their belief that disengagement was the correct choice. Economic reality added another layer. As inflation rose and purchasing power declined, the traditional incentives tied to partnership weakened. Men realized that combining resources did not guarantee stability. In some cases, it increased vulnerability. The idea that commitment automatically improved quality of life no longer aligned with observable outcomes. Rational actors adjust to incentives and the incentives had changed. This recalibration affected not only personal relationships but also work culture. Men became more selective about where they invested their effort. Loyalty declined. Overtime became optional. Career ambition was rebalanced against mental health. Men were no longer willing to sacrifice everything for institutions that offered little security in return. This shift mirrored their approach to relationships. Invest where returns are clear, withdraw where costs are excessive. The broader society struggled to adapt to this new male orientation. Many systems were built on the assumption of male overparticipation. When that assumption failed, cracks appeared. Labor shortages emerged in demanding fields. Productivity declined. The expectation that men would fill gaps without complaint proved incorrect. The system had optimized itself around an outdated model of male compliance. At the same time, women faced a different reckoning. Many had been encouraged to view independence as complete self sufficiency, but independence without collaboration can become isolation. As men withdrew, the absence of partnership became more tangible. Emotional support, shared burden, and mutual reliance were harder to replace than anticipated. This realization was not universal, but it was widespread enough to shift public conversation. However, by the time the shift occurred, many men were already gone, not physically absent, but psychologically unavailable. They were no longer invested in fixing what they perceived as broken beyond repair. Trust, once lost, is not easily restored, and trust had been eroded not by a single event, but by years of accumulated experiences that signaled to men that their best efforts would never be enough. Another critical factor was the erosion of respect. Respect is not demanded, it is felt. Men noticed that respect had been replaced by compliance. They were expected to agree, to adapt, to yield. Disagreement was framed as hostility. Boundaries were framed as insecurity. Over time, men learned that asserting themselves came with penalties, while withdrawing came with peace. The choice became obvious. This environment also changed how men perceived intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires trust. Without trust, intimacy becomes risk. Men responded by closing off emotionally, not out of spite, but out of caution. This emotional self protection was reinforced each time vulnerability was met with criticism or leverage. Eventually, many men decided that emotional independence was safer than emotional openness. As these patterns solidified, the idea of returning to traditional dating and marriage felt increasingly unrealistic for many men. The cost benefit analysis no longer favored participation. Even men who valued companionship questioned whether the current framework allowed for it. In response, some looked abroad. Others opted out entirely. Both choices reflected the same underlying conclusion. The system, as it exists, does not serve them. What makes this moment especially significant is that it lacks a clear villain. This is not a story of one group defeating another. It is a story of incentives, messaging, and unintended consequences. Society sent a message, and men listened. They adjusted. The outcome was not what society expected, but it was entirely predictable. As the gap between expectation and reality widened, frustration grew on all sides. But frustration without reflection leads nowhere. Blame without accountability solves nothing. If reconciliation is ever to occur, it will require a fundamental shift in how value, responsibility, and respect are distributed. That shift cannot be forced, it must be earned. As absence became the defining feature of this shift, Its effects rippled outward in subtle but powerful ways. Systems that once relied on default participation suddenly found themselves operating without the expected inputs. Social norms that assumed cooperation now faced indifference. Men were no longer reacting emotionally to criticism or pressure because they had already stepped outside the frame. When someone is no longer invested, persuasion loses its leverage. This quiet disengagement proved more disruptive than open conflict ever could have been. What many observers failed to understand was that men did not leave with grand declarations or dramatic exits. They left incrementally. One less conversation, one less date, one less compromise, one less explanation. Over time, those small withdrawals accumulated into a widespread pattern. By the time it became visible, it was already entrenched. There was no single moment to point to, no headline event to reverse. The shift had happened beneath the surface, where habits form and beliefs solidify. This gradual nature made it difficult for institutions to respond. Policies and narratives are designed to address loud problems, not silent ones. A protest can be negotiated with, silence cannot. Men who disengaged were not asking for reform, they were not presenting demands. They were simply choosing a different way to live. That choice removed them from the negotiation entirely. Another overlooked aspect of this change was how it altered male friendships and communities. As men withdrew from romantic pursuits, many redirected their social energy toward smaller, more reliable circles. Friendships became fewer, but deeper. Activities became more intentional. There was less posturing and more honesty. In these spaces, men felt understood without having to constantly explain themselves. This reinforced the appeal of stepping away from environments that felt adversarial or performative. This internal shift also changed how men processed criticism. Previously, criticism had power because it threatened belonging. Once belonging was no longer the goal, criticism lost its sting. Men became indifferent to labels and narratives that once shaped their self image. This indifference was often misread as hostility, but it was closer to neutrality. When you stop seeking approval, disapproval becomes background noise. At a cultural level, this neutrality was unsettling. Many systems depend on emotional engagement, whether positive or negative. Outrage, guilt, pride, and shame are all tools of influence. Men opting out emotionally remove themselves from that influence. They could no longer be easily mobilized, redirected, or corrected. That created uncertainty for institutions accustomed to predictable responses. Economic behavior reflected this change as well. Men spent differently. They prioritized durability over status, experiences over displays, savings over consumption. This shift affected industries built on aspirational marketing. When fewer men sought validation through purchases, demand patterns changed. Again, this was not an act of protest, it was a byproduct of changed priorities. The narrative around ambition also evolved. For many men, ambition had been closely tied to external rewards, recognition, and relational success. As those rewards lost their appeal, ambition became quieter and more personal. Men still worked hard, but often for different reasons. Mastery replaced applause, stability replaced visibility. This internalization of motivation made men less responsive to external incentives. One of the most significant consequences of this shift was the decline of shared expectations. In the past, even flawed systems functioned because participants agreed implicitly on certain goals. Marriage, family, career progression, and social status formed a shared roadmap. As men stepped away from that roadmap, alignment fractured. Without shared expectations, coordination becomes difficult. Each individual optimizes for personal outcomes and collective cohesion weakens. This fragmentation affected not only relationships, but also generational continuity. Younger men Observing older men who appeared calmer and more self directed after disengaging internalized those lessons early. They did not have to experience burnout themselves to learn from it. This observational learning accelerated the trend. What once took decades now took years. The cultural conversation struggled to keep pace. Much of it remained anchored in outdated assumptions about male motivation. Appeals to duty, guilt, or tradition fell flat. Those concepts only resonate when the underlying trust remains intact. Once trust is gone, appeals sound hollow. Men were not rejecting responsibility as a concept, they were rejecting responsibility that came without reciprocity. This distinction is critical. Men did not abandon responsibility altogether. They became highly responsible for their own lives. They maintained routines, paid bills, supported dependents where applicable, and contributed in chosen ways. What they abandoned was the expectation that they must sacrifice themselves indefinitely for systems that offered diminishing returns. Responsibility without agency is not sustainable. As this reality settled in, the idea that men would simply return once conditions improved began to look unrealistic. Many men had already adapted. Their lives no longer revolved around waiting for permission or approval. They had built structures that worked for them. Disrupting those structures would require a compelling reason, not just nostalgia for how things used to be. Another subtle but important change occurred in how men viewed compromise. In healthy systems, compromise is mutual. In unhealthy ones, compromise becomes asymmetrical. Men recognized that many compromises asked of them were not temporary adjustments, but permanent concessions. Once given, they were rarely returned. Over time, men learned to guard their boundaries more carefully. Saying no became easier. Walking away became acceptable. This boundary setting was often framed negatively by external observers, but from the inside, it felt necessary. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. Men filtered out environments that demanded constant justification. They gravitated toward spaces where respect was implicit rather than negotiated. The emotional landscape shifted accordingly. Men reported feeling less anxious and less reactive. Without constant relational tension, emotional bandwidth expanded. This allowed for greater focus, creativity, and long term planning. Again, these benefits reinforced the decision to remain disengaged from high conflict dynamics. Meanwhile, public discourse continued to search for explanations that did not involve systemic self reflection. Individual pathology was easier to discuss than structural incentives, but focusing on individual motives missed the larger picture. This was not about isolated choices, it was about aggregated behavior, responding rationally to incentives over time. The longer this pattern persisted, the more it reshaped norms. Being single became normalized. Living alone became acceptable. Choosing peace over partnership became a valid life path rather than a temporary phase. Once a behavior is normalized, it stops being stigmatized. Once stigma fades, reversal becomes unlikely. This normalization also affected how men spoke to one another. Advice shifted. Older men no longer encouraged younger men to endure dissatisfaction for promised rewards. They encouraged caution, self respect, and patience. This advice transmission mattered. Cultural norms are sustained through informal mentorship as much as formal messaging. That mentorship had changed direction. At the same time, many women faced their own internal reassessment. Expectations shaped by decades of messaging encountered real world constraints. The assumption that independence would seamlessly replace partnership proved incomplete. This did not invalidate independence, but it complicated it. However, recognizing this complexity did not automatically restore trust or availability on the other side. Trust, once broken, does not respond to urgency, it responds to consistency over time. And time is precisely what cannot be accelerated. Men who disengaged were not waiting for short term changes. They were operating under long term assumptions. Reversing that would require sustained evidence, not rhetoric. As a result, society entered a holding pattern. Men remained disengaged. Women adjusted expectations unevenly. Institutions struggled to adapt. No single actor could resolve the imbalance alone. This stasis created frustration, but also clarity. The old assumptions no longer applied. A new equilibrium was forming, whether acknowledged or not. This equilibrium is quieter than past eras, but no less consequential. It is defined by selective participation, guarded trust, and individualized definitions of success. It lacks the dramatic clashes of previous cultural shifts, but its impact is deeper, precisely because it operates without spectacle. And as this new equilibrium settles in, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The era of automatic male participation is over. What replaces it will depend on whether respect, reciprocity, and shared purpose can be rebuilt. Until then, men will continue choosing peace over pressure, autonomy over obligation, and distance over conflict. That choice, repeated millions of times, is reshaping the social landscape in ways that will be felt for generations. As this new equilibrium took shape, one of the most revealing developments was how quickly men adapted once they stopped resisting reality. There was a period of adjustment, a phase where expectations had to be recalibrated and long held beliefs dismantled. But once that process was complete, many men reported a surprising sense of clarity. The confusion that once dominated their decisions faded, replaced by a straightforward understanding of what they would and would not tolerate. This clarity became a stabilizing force. It reduced internal conflict and made choices simpler. When you know your boundaries, indecision loses its grip. This clarity also reshaped how men viewed risk. In earlier stages of life, risk was often framed as something to be embraced in pursuit of external rewards. Take the risk, make the move, prove yourself. Over time, men learned that some risks carried asymmetric consequences. The downside was substantial, while the upside was uncertain or diminishing. With maturity came a more conservative approach to exposure. Men did not stop taking risks altogether. They became selective. They took calculated risks in areas they could control and avoided those that placed their well being in the hands of unstable systems. This recalibration was often mistaken for fear or withdrawal from life, but it was the opposite. It was engagement on different terms. Men were still active, still productive, still curious. They simply redirected their energy toward pursuits that offered proportional returns. Learning new skills, building financial resilience, improving physical health, exploring creative outlets. These pursuits provided tangible benefits without the emotional volatility that had come to define other areas of life. Another shift emerged in how men related to authority and narrative. For a long time, cultural authority figures shaped acceptable viewpoints. Men were expected to internalize these narratives even when they conflicted with lived experience. As disengagement increased, so did skepticism. Men began to trust their observations over prescribed explanations. This was not rebellion, it was discernment. When official narratives failed to match reality, credibility eroded. This erosion of credibility had cascading effects. Messaging that once motivated action now produced indifference. Campaigns designed to shame or inspire participation fell flat. Men were no longer emotionally invested in maintaining an image aligned with external expectations. Image management requires energy. Men had decided that energy was better spent elsewhere. As image lost importance, authenticity gained ground. Men spoke more plainly in private circles. How about? They were less concerned with appearing agreeable and more focused on being honest. This honesty was often quiet, shared among trusted peers rather than broadcast publicly. It did not seek validation, it sought understanding. In these conversations, men compared notes, recognized shared experiences, and confirmed that their decisions were not isolated anomalies, but part of a broader pattern. This recognition reduced self doubt. When men realized that others had reached similar conclusions independently, confidence increased. They were not imagining the imbalance, they were responding rationally to it. This collective awareness further solidified the trend. Once a behavior is validated socially, even within small circles, it becomes easier to maintain. Meanwhile, institutions continue to operate as if participation could be assumed. This assumption led to miscalculations. Programs were designed without accounting for disengagement. Policies were drafted without considering declining buy in. When outcomes failed to meet expectations, the response was often confusion rather than introspection. Systems rarely question their foundational assumptions until forced to. The labor market provided a clear example. Fields that relied heavily on endurance, long hours, or high stress struggled to attract new entrants. The old narrative of sacrifice for future reward no longer resonated. Men asked practical questions. What is the return? What is the cost? What is the exit? If those questions lacked satisfactory answers, interest declined. This pragmatic approach altered workforce dynamics in ways that are still unfolding. Another area affected was civic engagement. Participation in traditional community structures waned. Men who once volunteered time and effort without hesitation became more selective. They asked whether their contribution would be respected or taken for granted. Where respect was absent, participation dwindled. This shift did not stem from apathy, it stemmed from experience. As engagement declined, a paradox emerged. Society lamented the loss of involvement while continuing to dismiss the reasons behind it. This disconnect deepened frustration on all sides. Men felt unheard, institutions felt abandoned. But abandonment was not the cause, it was the consequence. Addressing consequences without addressing causes rarely leads to resolution. The personal lives of men reflected these broader trends. Many structured their days around predictability and control. Routines became anchors. Physical training, disciplined schedules, and quiet evenings replaced chaotic social calendars. These choices were not antisocial, they were stabilizing. In a world that felt increasingly uncertain, control over one's immediate environment became invaluable. This focus on stability also influenced how men approached aging. Rather than chasing milestones defined by others, they planned for longevity and resilience. Health, financial independence, and mental clarity took precedence. This long term orientation reduced impulsivity and increased patience. Men were no longer rushing to meet externally imposed timelines. At the same time, the conversation around fulfillment evolved. Fulfillment was no longer framed solely as relational success, it became multifaceted. Purpose could be found in craftsmanship, mentorship, learning, or contribution on chosen terms. This diversification of fulfillment reduced dependency on any single source of meaning. When meaning is diversified, loss in one area does not destabilize the whole. This shift had implications for emotional regulation as well. Men became less reactive because fewer things felt existentially threatening. When you are no longer staking your identity on external approval, criticism becomes informational rather than personal. You can accept or reject it without internal collapse. This emotional resilience was often misinterpreted as detachment, but it was closer to composure. As composure increased, so did discernment. Men assessed situations more calmly. They recognized patterns earlier. They exited unfavorable dynamics sooner. This reduced exposure to prolonged stress. Over time, stress levels declined. The body responded accordingly. Better sleep, improved focus, greater physical vitality. These tangible benefits reinforced the value of disengagement from high conflict environments. Public discourse continued to lag behind these lived realities. Simplistic explanations persisted. Complex outcomes were attributed to single causes, but the truth was layered. Economic pressure, cultural messaging, legal frameworks, and social incentives all interacted over time. Men did not respond to one factor in isolation, they responded to the cumulative effect. This cumulative effect produced a mindset shift that is difficult to reverse. Once men internalize the idea that peace is something they must protect actively, they become vigilant. They notice early warning signs. They avoid situations that threaten equilibrium. This vigilance is not paranoia, it is learned behavior. The longer this mindset persists, the more it reshapes expectations for future generations. Younger men grow up with different reference points. They do not assume that traditional pathways are obligatory. They see alternatives modeled. They plan accordingly. This generational handoff ensures continuity of the trend. What makes this particularly challenging for society is that there is no lever to pull that guarantees re engagement. Incentives must align genuinely. Trust must be rebuilt slowly. Respect must be demonstrated consistently. These are long processes. They cannot be expedited through messaging alone. Until such alignment occurs, men will continue to operate independently. They will collaborate selectively. They will invest cautiously. They will prioritize peace. This is not a temporary phase. It is a rational adaptation to observed conditions. As this adaptation becomes more widespread, its effects compound. Systems adjust, norms shift, expectations recalibrate. What once seemed unthinkable becomes normal. This normalization is the final stage of any cultural transformation. We are now living within that stage. The conversation is catching up, but the behavior has already changed. And behavior, not rhetoric, is what ultimately shapes reality. This is the world as it stands now. A world where many men have quietly stepped back, not out of spite, but out of self respect. A world adjusting to their absence, a world learning, perhaps too late, that participation cannot be demanded indefinitely without consequence. As this reality becomes more visible, it exposes a misconception that shaped much of the earlier cultural messaging. The idea was that men needed society more than society needed men, that if pressure increased, compliance would follow. What was underestimated was men's capacity to adapt without spectacle. Adaptation does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like quiet reorientation. When men realized that they could meet their needs without constant social approval, the leverage that once kept them engaged evaporated. This reorientation did not happen in isolation. It occurred alongside a broader loss of faith in institutions. Economic volatility, shifting rules, and inconsistent outcomes eroded confidence across the board. Men noticed that promises made by institutions were often revised after commitment was secured. Expectations were stable, only in one direction. Responsibility remained fixed while rewards fluctuated. This asymmetry bred caution. Men learned to read the fine print of social contracts, not just the headlines. As caution increased, so did intentionality. Men became deliberate about where they invested time and attention. They evaluated environments based on how they felt after leaving them. Did they feel clearer or drained, calm or agitated, grounded or diminished? These internal signals became reliable guides. Over time, men learned to trust them more than external advice. This self trust was a critical turning point. It reduced dependence on approval and increased confidence in personal judgment. This shift also altered how men experienced the community. Large, impersonal structures lost appeal, smaller, voluntary associations gained importance. Groups formed around shared interests rather than shared obligation. Participation was chosen, not assumed. In these spaces, accountability was mutual and respect was implicit. Men could contribute without being scrutinized for hidden intent. This restored a sense of ease that had been missing elsewhere. Ease is often overlooked as a value, but it matters deeply. When interactions feel easy, people engage more freely. When they feel tense, people withdraw. Men had learned through experience that many mainstream spaces had become just an emotionally charged and unpredictable. Choosing ease was not avoidance, it was optimization. Men optimized for environments that supported well being rather than challenged it constantly. Another underappreciated consequence of disengagement was the restoration of agency. Agency is the feeling that your choices matter and that you can influence outcomes. In many traditional pathways, men felt their agency shrinking. Decisions were constrained, options narrowed, outcomes felt predetermined. Stepping outside those pathways restored a sense of control. Even uncertainty felt preferable to scripted participation. This restoration of agency influenced how men approached learning and growth. Instead of pursuing credentials or milestones for recognition, they focused on competence, practical skills, financial literacy, physical conditioning, emotional regulation. These forms of growth produced immediate, observable benefits. They reinforced self efficacy. Men could see the results of their effort directly without intermediaries. As self efficacy increased, dependency decreased. Men relied less on validation from partners, employers, or social groups. This independence was not isolation, it was autonomy. Autonomy allowed men to engage from a position of choice rather than need. That distinction reshaped interactions. When you do not need something, you can negotiate fairly. When you need it, you accept unfavorable terms. This recalibration made some interactions uncomfortable for others. Men who set boundaries were sometimes labeled difficult or disengaged, but boundaries are only threatening to systems that rely on overextension. Healthy systems adapt to boundaries, unhealthy ones resist them. Men observed which systems adapted and which did not, and they made decisions accordingly. As this pattern repeated, a broader cultural tension emerged. Expectations had not caught up with behavior. Many narratives still assumed male overparticipation as the default. When that participation did not materialize, frustration grew. But frustration without understanding leads to misdiagnosis. The focus remained on symptoms rather than causes. The causes were not mysterious, they were cumulative. Years of messaging that framed men as problems to be managed rather than partners to be valued. Years of policies that treated male contribution as guaranteed rather than earned. Years of social dynamics that rewarded compliance over character. None of these factors alone would have triggered widespread disengagement. Together, they created conditions where disengagement made sense. One of the most revealing moments in this process was how men responded to calls for return. When appeals were made to duty or nostalgia, they fell flat. Men had already interrogated those concepts. Duty without reciprocity had lost meaning. Nostalgia for a past that did not deliver on its promises held little appeal. Men were not rejecting history, they were rejecting repetition. Calls for empathy were also common, but empathy without accountability felt performative. Men had spent years being asked to empathize while their own concerns were dismissed. Empathy, to be meaningful, must be mutual. Without mutuality, it becomes another demand. Men recognized this pattern and declined to engage with it. What did resonate, in rare cases, was consistency. Environments where expectations were clear and stable, where feedback was fair, where effort was acknowledged, attracted participation. These environments demonstrated that engagement was still possible under the right conditions. But such environments were exceptions rather than the rule. This uneven distribution of positive experiences reinforced selectivity. Men did not conclude that all engagement was futile. They concluded that indiscriminate engagement was. Selectivity became the guiding principle. Engage where conditions are favorable, withdraw where they are not. This principle applied across domains from work to relationships to community involvement. Over time, this selectivity reshaped male identity. Identity became less tied to roles imposed from outside and more tied to values chosen from within. Integrity, consistency, calm. These values guided decisions. When faced with pressure to conform, men asked whether conformity aligned with their values. If not, they declined. This internal compass replaced external benchmarks. This internalization of values had a stabilizing effect. Men experienced fewer internal conflicts because decisions aligned with principles. Alignment reduces cognitive dissonance. Reduced dissonance reduces stress. Reduced stress improves health. This chain reaction made disengagement not just emotionally appealing, but physically beneficial. As men became healthier and more grounded, the narrative that disengagement was driven by weakness became harder to sustain. Weakness does not produce clarity. Weakness does not produce resilience. What emerged instead was a picture of adaptation. Men adapted to conditions in ways that preserved well being. Adaptation, however, is often misread as indifference. Indifference is emotionally flat. Adaptation is responsive. Men responded to incentives, they responded to patterns, they responded to outcomes. When outcomes changed, responses changed. This is not apathy, it is learning. Learning accumulated across the population. Individual lessons became collective wisdom. That wisdom circulated quietly through conversations, observations, and shared experiences. It did not require coordination, it spread organically. This organic spread is what makes the shift durable. There is no central leader to remove, no single message to counter. The change is embedded in behavior. As behavior changed, the social fabric adjusted. New norms formed around independence. New expectations emerged around boundaries. The definition of success diversified. These changes did not make headlines, but they altered daily life. Cultural shifts often begin this way, through countless small decisions rather than grand movements. The long term implications of this shift are still unfolding. Family formation patterns change, housing choices shift, consumption trends evolve, political priorities realign. None of these outcomes can be traced to a single cause, but they share a common root in disengagement driven by misaligned incentives. Addressing these outcomes will require more than surface level fixes. It will require a willingness to examine foundational assumptions, assumptions about obligation, about value, about respect. Without that examination, attempts at repair will remain superficial. For now, men continue navigating the landscape as it is rather than as it was promised to be. They build lives that make sense to them. They choose peace over pressure. They invest where returns are tangible. They disengage where costs are excessive. This is not a dramatic story, it is a quiet one. But quiet stories often have the most lasting impact because they change how people live, not just how they talk. And as this quiet transformation continues, it becomes increasingly clear that any future reconciliation will not be achieved by asking men to return to old roles. It will only be possible by creating new conditions where participation is genuinely valued rather than assumed. Until then, the path men have chosen remains rational, consistent, and deeply rooted in lived experience. As this chapter of social change reaches its later stages, what stands out most is not anger or chaos, but acceptance. Men who have stepped back are no longer debating whether they made the right choice. That question has already been answered through lived experience. Their days are calmer, their minds are clearer, their lives feel manageable again. When a decision consistently produces better outcomes over time, it stops being questioned. It becomes a baseline. And once something becomes a baseline, returning to a previous state feels unnatural rather than comforting. This acceptance has quietly replaced the earlier frustration that many men once carried. There was a time when disengagement was accompanied by confusion and disappointment, a sense that something valuable had been lost. Over time, that sense faded. What replaced it was a grounded understanding that not every loss is negative and not every departure is a failure. Sometimes leaving is simply the recognition that an environment no longer supports growth. Men internalize this lesson not through theory, but through experience. As they adjusted, men stopped framing their lives as reactions to what society had done wrong. That framing, while initially validating, still kept them emotionally tied to the very dynamics they were trying to escape. True disengagement required something deeper. It required indifference to validation and disapproval alike. When men reached that point, their decisions became forward looking rather than corrective. They were no longer trying to fix the past, they were building futures that felt stable and honest. This forward focus is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the shift. From the outside, disengagement can look like stagnation. From the inside, it feels like momentum directed inward. Men channel energy into things that compound quietly over time. Health routines that improve year after year, financial habits that reduce stress rather than amplify it, skills that provide independence, relationships that are voluntary and reciprocal. These are not flashy pursuits, but they are durable ones. Durability has become a central value. Men learned that systems and relationships built on volatility eventually collapse under their own weight. Stability, once dismissed as boring or unambitious, revealed itself as a form of wealth. Predictable days, manageable responsibilities, clear expectations. These elements create space for creativity and growth without constant crisis. Men did not abandon ambition, they redefined it. This redefinition also altered how men perceive success stories presented by culture. Loud displays of achievement lost their appeal. Quiet competence gained respect. Men became less interested in being admired and more interested in being unbothered. This shift reduced susceptibility to manipulation. When admiration is no longer the goal, many incentives lose their pull. The broader cultural conversation continues to lag behind these internal changes. Public debates still frame the issue as temporary or reversible through surface level adjustments. But from the perspective of those who have disengaged, the change feels structural. It is not about specific grievances, it is about trust. And trust, once eroded over long periods, does not return quickly or easily. This does not mean that reconciliation is impossible in principle. It means that reconciliation, if it ever happens, will look different than before. It will not involve returning to old roles or reviving outdated expectations. It would require entirely new frameworks built on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and realistic incentives. It would require patience rather than urgency, listening rather than lecturing, and consistency rather than slogans. Until such frameworks emerge, men will continue living as they are now. They will engage selectively. They will avoid environments that feel unstable or adversarial. They will invest in themselves and in small, trusted circles. This way of life is not driven by resentment, it is driven by preference. And preferences are far more powerful than protests because they shape behavior quietly and persistently. The long-term effects of this shift will continue to unfold across generations. Younger men, having grown up observing the outcomes of disengagement, will make choices earlier and with less hesitation. They will not carry the same assumptions their predecessors did. They will not assume that participation is mandatory or that sacrifice guarantees reward. They will evaluate conditions and decide accordingly. This generational transmission ensures that the shift is not a temporary anomaly, but an enduring trend. Society will adapt in response, whether intentionally or not. Some systems will reform to attract genuine participation, others will shrink or fade. This is how social evolution works. It is not guided by moral declarations, but by aggregated choices. Millions of small decisions shape the future more reliably than any single policy or movement. What we are witnessing then is not the collapse of society, but its reconfiguration. Old assumptions are being tested against reality and found lacking. New patterns are emerging to replace them. The process is uneven and uncomfortable, but it is also honest. It reflects what people are actually willing to do, not what they are told they should do. Men, having stepped back, are no longer asking to be understood. They are simply living according to what they have learned. That learning came at a cost, but it also brought clarity. Clarity brings peace. Peace brings stability. And stability becomes the foundation for whatever comes next. Whether society chooses to meet men where they are or continue operating on outdated assumptions remains to be seen. What is clear is that the old approach no longer works. The damage done to trust cannot be ignored or rushed past. It must be acknowledged and addressed with sincerity if there is to be any meaningful change. Until then, the path forward for many men is already set. It is quiet, it is intentional, it is grounded in lived experience rather than ideology, and it is not waiting for permission. Before we close, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the direction things are moving? Have you noticed similar changes in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they help bring clarity to issues that are often ignored or misunderstood. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.